can you actually describe specifically what Bitcoin Core Standardness is, what is mempool relay policy, and then the difference between Bitcoin consensus and Bitcoin Core Standardness?
Explaining is standard. What is standard in Bitcoin? Basically, every node on Bitcoin has a function built into it, and it's called is standard. And think of it like a bouncer, okay? And it basically says, are you good enough to get in my mempool, or do you fit within the bounds of the mempool? And some transactions are cool enough, most are cool enough to fit in the mempool, but every once in a while, you get this weirdo who comes in, and the bouncer goes, you don't look very friendly. You're dressed weird, And it says, no, you're not getting accepted into the mempool. And so that is what the is standard function. It literally says, is this transaction standard? And if you are not standard as a transaction, you get removed from the node, and you do not get to pass into the event, right? And what happens if you go into the event, basically that is quote unquote your node, putting the transaction in the mempool, and also additionally relaying it to the next node as well, which will also do the exact same function again. They have their own bouncer. And as long as your transaction is part of this standard group, you should be able to go into each event all the way along, and eventually you'll get to a miner. But like I said, it's sometimes there are scripts or Bitcoin transactions. If you try to lock your thing up in a weird way, they don't quite like that, the nodes. And so is standard is a way to essentially filter transactions that go into the mempool, hence the name filter policy or relay policy, and typically associated with filtering. And the most common thing that I think people have demand for that gets filtered are going to be the 4 megabyte transactions. Right now on Bitcoin, the bouncer, quote unquote, for your mempool will say you can be 1/10 the size of the Bitcoin block, or 400,000 weight units. But there's a lot of demand for people to buy the entire block to run like a Bitcoin script and have that store so far data. But you can also do more interesting things like BitVM and actually execute code. So that's a typical thing that a bouncer says, hey, or the is standard policy says, hey, we're not going to take that to our mempool. That's too big. That's heavy. That's problematic. It takes a lot of bandwidth. Just get rid of it. And so Marathon with Slipstream, we basically told the bouncer or the is standard function, we're cool with these things. Like, if you're 4 megabyte, you're welcome into our mempool. If you have 2 op returns, it's cool. Come into our mempool. But we will charge you a little extra because you're a little bit burdensome to us, right? Like, we want you, but we also know there's an arbitrage opportunity between like, hey, this is still a valid Bitcoin transaction according to Bitcoin, but most nodes on the network will make this very difficult for you to get to a miner. And so, that's kind of what is standard is. It's a function to check if a Bitcoin transaction is standard. And kind of I guess I'll mention real quick the names of these standard ones, but you might hear of like legacy Bitcoin transactions that start with like a 1 in the address. These are typically like standard pay to witness script hash and pay to witness public key hash. These are the SegWit versions of these things, or a taproot transaction. These are all standard. And you will have, if you're doing these types of transactions and they're not too big, then they'll flow right across the network. You will never touch any of this stuff. But like, for example, one thing is with Taproot, you can actually create a non-standard Taproot transaction when, for example, you want to embed a JPEG into it. So this is where you take arbitrary data and then you do a special part in the tap script, op0, op-if, and then it doesn't execute that code, but it literally just stores that information on Bitcoin. And that, if you go above the standardness limits, so 400,000 weight units, then your transaction, if you send it off, the first node that it gets to very likely will go, nope, and it won't even enter the mempool. It won't go anywhere. And you'll notice your transaction won't show up on mempool.space. It won't get mined. It's DOA. That is what standardness is. Consensus is all things that are valid on Bitcoin. So basically, any Bitcoin script that isn't forbidden to create, right? And there are limits to that. One limit is, well, why is the limit 4 megabytes of data on Bitcoin, or 4 megabytes for a script? Well, that limit is consensus, because you can't actually create a block that is bigger than 4 megabytes. So you can think of like the difference between consensus policy and relay policy. Consensus policy is like physics on planet Earth, right? Like, we're bound to gravity. We're never going to change gravity. That's just a property of it, right? The fact is we have inertia, all these different properties, thermodynamics. Like, we interact within the system. Relay policy is the jurisdictional rule on how we need to interact within that system. So even though physics says you can open up a locked door with enough force, we do have rules to say, no, you don't or shouldn't do that, right? And that's kind of like relay policy is like the jurisdictional law. Consensus is physics. It's literally just the rule of Bitcoin. There is no greater set of rules in Bitcoin than consensus rules. And with that said, relay policy is always going to be smaller than basically consensus. So relay policy is like this big of a box. Consensus is the rest of the frame. So